We see 11 more hot days today than we would have 10 years ago. And that means 11 days globally on average where mortality will be very high.
There's really this global momentum around clean energy that at this point is unstoppable.
This is Today as It Happened. Good Thursday evening to you. I'm Holly Furfer here with your chronological look at the biggest events and stories of the day. From developments in the ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas to day 16 of the federal government shutdown. But first this morning, we took a look at a landmark new report on climate change. Well, 10 years after the Paris Climate Agreement, scientists in a new report say that we are on track to avoid the worst-case climate scenario, but the world is still on a dangerously hot path. The accord, signed by nearly all countries in 2015, lays out plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions with the overachieving goal to limit temperature increases across the world. Every fraction of a degree means more deadly heat, more health risks, more days where working or even surviving outdoors becomes even harder. Scripps News business and tech correspondent Maura Barrett reviewed that report and now has more for us. And Maura, how much of a difference has that Paris Climate Agreement made? And is this good news?
There is some good news buried in here. And I want to be clear about that because the initial headline is that we're going to see the world is on track to see about 2 months of more super hot days. And the way that the report is defining super hot days is any days that are warmer than 90% of the comparable dates from years prior. And so that shows over the next 100 or so years, we're going to see about 57 super hot days. But that is a difference than the 114 days scientists originally said that we were going to have those super hot days if none of these efforts were in place by countries around the world. Remember, the overarching goal of the Paris Climate Agreement is to hopefully not increase global temperatures by more than 2 degrees Celsius. And so what they're looking at right now with the efforts that have been in place, trying to curb emissions across the world and making renewable and sustainable choices and countries committing to that, they're tracking to see a 2.6-degree increase. And so the way the report laid it out, if we see the 2.6-degree increase, that's where we're going to get those 57 hot days. Whereas if nothing was done, if the Paris Agreement hadn't been in place, scientists predict we would have seen a 4-degree Celsius increase, which would result in those over 100 super hot days. And so forgive me for so many numbers and science and math this early in the morning, Holly, but the overarching takeaway from this report is that heat is now the deadliest threat when it comes to climate issues on Earth. And what we need to do, what scientists are really calling out, is increase efforts to pull back on fossil fuels, invest in adaptations. They called out issues with financing in that sense. But it's really important to highlight because obviously we've been covering heat waves year after year. 2024 was the hottest year on record. 2023 is just behind that. And globally, 500,000 deaths are attributed to heat every year. And so in addition to the deadly heat concerns, heat also just exacerbates a lot of health issues. It's a worker protection issue for people that work outside. And obviously, different countries have different ways of mitigating. Some countries don't have air conditioning. And haven't had to in the past. And so that's something that the scientists had called out in terms of what adaptations are needed. But ultimately, they pressured and they tried to say that, and focused on the fact that while there is good news out of this report, that there are hints and evidence now that the Paris Climate Agreement is working, that effort just needs to continue to hopefully bring down that 2.6 degree increase, ideally under 2 degrees, because even with the 2.6 increase, that's going to be really, really devastating for people here in the next century, Holly.
And Maura, with the Trump administration pulling out of that Paris Climate Agreement and leaning into fossil fuels again, is this report's roadmap still realistic? I mean, what difference does the U.S. behavior make globally?
It's massive. And the U.S. pulling out, scientists kind of highlighted, this is probably more of a posture, and it signifies the lack of emphasis from the U.S. Remember, the U.S. is the second largest global emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. We know that that's what directly raises temperatures. They're the second largest after China. And so if the U.S. isn't on board with trying to curb these emissions, and we've seen the Trump administration, as you mentioned, pivot towards investing more in fossil fuels, reinvigorating those efforts, and drawing back major cuts across renewable energy, that sends a sign to the world that maybe it's not as important as the Paris Climate Agreement is saying it is. And the scientists push back against that. They also point to a UN court ruling this summer that you may remember that we covered earlier this summer, that ruled that a safe environment is a human right, a clean and healthy, safe environment. And so scientists pointed out that will hold the U.S., that will hold other countries to a higher standard. I want to hear from one of the researchers who spoke in a press conference to reporters breaking down the report, just about the severity in terms of the deep, sustained cuts that they focused on in terms of pulling back on fossil fuels.
Not transitioning away from fossil fuels much faster and pursuing the highest possible ambition in emission reduction means reaching the goals in the agreement will be impossible. And that'll mean death, the loss of livelihoods on a huge scale.
And so the fossil fuel reduction is the key point here. She went on to say that even with adaptation efforts, even with building up resilience, they're going to reach a plateau. And so that's why they really need countries to focus on curbing those emissions. I think it's important to note that the U.S., as it goes through the process of pulling out of the agreement, will be only one of 4 countries that's not in the agreement. So I think that sends a signal. But the good news on that front, too, and I'm trying to highlight the positives here, is that on a state and local level domestically, there is still a lot of investment in renewable energy across certain states, as well as infrastructure adaptations, building new buildings with LEED certified building methods. And I think the other important note, another story we covered, is that from a federal standpoint, OSHA is considering putting worker protections into place, putting new heat standards into place that would protect people that work outside. So there are a lot of different avenues in which scientists are saying that we need to tackle. And so even with the U.S. pulling out of this agreement, this global accord, there are other local entities that are still pushing forward, Holly.
All right. Scripps News business and tech correspondent Maura Barrett live for us. Thank you for that really important update. We appreciate all of that. Authorities say they've identified 14 of the 16 people killed in last week's explosion at a Tennessee explosives plant. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation is using rapid DNA testing to identify those victims, comparing samples from family members to remains found at the scene. The victims range from 21 to 60 years old. Humphreys County Sheriff Chris Davis says the investigation could take months because of the massive scale and delicate nature of the scene. Authorities say there were no survivors, and some evidence may be spread out over miles. Investigators in Illinois are trying to figure out what caused a grain bin to collapse Wednesday. It happened at a farmers cooperative in Iroquois County. All of the workers are okay. We're told employees actually noticed the silo showing signs of distress about an hour before that collapse, and they evacuated the site. Specialty contractors are now cleaning up the spilled grain, while structural engineers determine the extent of the damage. Coming up on Today As It Happened.
We are demanding Hamas release the remaining hostages, the 19 hostages whose bodies are still being held inside of the Gaza Strip.
Welcome back to Today As It Happened. Let's check back in on our daily briefing of the day's top stories. Israel's National Institute of Forensic Medicine on Thursday identified remains of 2 more hostages returned from Gaza. Since Monday's exchange, Hamas has returned 10 bodies, 9 of which Israel's military has identified as hostages. Scripps News international correspondent Blake Sifton has covered the war for us throughout and joins us now from Tel Aviv with the latest. And Blake, I know tensions are rising over the slow return of these deceased hostages by Hamas, but what more can you tell us about the situation?
The Israeli government has accused Hamas of purposely delaying the return of hostage bodies. And we heard from Israel's defense minister on Wednesday, who said that if Hamas does not honor their obligations according to the ceasefire, Israel should go back to war. And in his words, he says that he has tasked the Israeli military with crushing Hamas. Now, Hamas say that they have now returned all of the bodies they're able to retrieve, and that retrieving future bodies will require heavy and specialized equipment that they don't have. Yesterday, we heard in a briefing from senior Trump administration officials who spoke to reporters and said that that version of events is apparently true. They say that Hamas is meeting its obligations under the ceasefire, but retrieving and returning more bodies will take time. It will require the assistance of international teams, but they said that no bodies would be left behind. They said that a 80-person strong team from Turkey is standing by to deploy to help retrieve bodies. And they also said that cash rewards will be offered to the people of Gaza for tips leading to the discovery and retrieval of more bodies. Now, today we also heard from the Umbrella Group representing family members of the hostages held in Gaza. They say that as long as Hamas does not return the bodies, that Israel should not honor its obligations under the ceasefire. One of those obligations is increasing the rate of aid entering Gaza. Some 600 trucks of aid are meant to enter Gaza every day. That is not happening. More aid has come into Gaza in recent days, but it's still well below that. And today the UN has called on Israel to open all of the crossings and to see that those crossings are operated efficiently because they say that they are ready to surge aid into Gaza and that they have some 3 months worth of meals waiting to enter the Strip.
Up next on Today As It Happened.
I say this case stinks to high heaven because this beautiful young lady who was 27 years old in the prime of her life, that she would take her own life is astounding.
This week, you may have heard a lot about Ellen Greenberg, a 27-year-old Philadelphia teacher who was found dead in her apartment in 2011 with more than 20 stab wounds and bruises. Now, this case has been controversial from the start. An assistant medical examiner at first declared the death a murder. Then, after talking to police and prosecutors, a suicide because she was found dead by her boyfriend behind her apartment door, locked from the inside. And she had no defensive wounds on her body. That medical examiner changed his mind again, saying in February of 2025, it was something other than suicide. All right, so to get to the bottom of what's really happening in this case, let's bring in Court TV's Julie Grant, a former assistant district attorney in Pennsylvania. Julie, good to see you, my friend. Let's start with this week. Where are we after months of going back over the details of more than a decade-old case? The medical examiner's office decided that, quote, while the distribution of injuries is admittedly unusual, the fact remains that Ellen would be capable of inflicting these injuries by herself. All right, in your opinion, did they make the right call? Did this ruling, is it a suicide? Is it not? I mean, you were there in Pennsylvania as a prosecutor. What say you?
Holly, it's great to be with you as well. I say this case stinks to high heaven. And I brought with me today this 32-page autopsy report review that was just issued, and it goes through so many facts about Ellen Greenberg's anxiety and what was going on in school that day. And much more of it is devoted to that than is devoted to the science, the injuries, and what occurred here. I say this case stinks to high heaven because this beautiful young lady who was 27 years old in the prime of her life, happy to be living well in a city that she loved, with a fiance that everyone believed that she loved. That she would take her own life is astounding. Her family can't believe it, and when you read the wounds that she suffered from, it's quite hard to believe that it has been deemed that way. 20 wounds in all, some of them, Holly, to the back of her neck and the back of her head. And there's one wound that's arguably one that some forensic pathologists believe could have paralyzed her because it punctured her cervical spine. The fatal wound, though, came to her heart. So the wounds to the back of her body and the back of her head had to have been done before the wounds to her chest. And let me set the scene for you. She was in her apartment. She's cutting up fruit in her kitchen. And something that we learned on Court TV, Scripps News' sister network, we learned this from a friend of the network. Reporter Joel Waldman spoke to Ellen Greenberg's father, who said that a fact that has not been widely reported is that Ellen had a bag packed that evening and that she was planning to leave the relationship. And that is something that, Holly, you won't see in the Hulu docuseries, and we don't see often talked about with this case. But now the Greenberg family no further along with this recent ruling of the manner of death being still suicide.
Wow. Okay, Julie, let's go back to this beginning. You bring up so many points here. So Greenberg's boyfriend, fiance at the time, said he had to break the door down to find her, but he was never considered a suspect. They say the door was locked from the inside, but why didn't they consider him a suspect? If he was a partner, wouldn't he have a key perhaps to her apartment? Am I wrong?
No, you're not wrong, Holly. You're asking all the right questions. So in terms of the key, he did have a key, and it's his contention that the door was latched with those metal latches. We see them in hotel rooms often, where there's a little edge that sticks out on one side of the door and then a swing bar that goes across it from the other side. And it's his contention that it was latched so that when he swiped his key, the door would only open so far, just a tiny amount, because that latch was stopping it from opening further. His contention to all of the first responders was that Ellen had latched it inside when he went to the gym, the apartment gym inside the building. And Holly, something I find very suspicious, we know he made a lot of phone calls to Ellen Greenberg when he was saying that she wouldn't open that door. The key card analysis from the building shows us that he entered the gym at 4:51 p.m. He exited through the lobby at 5:30 p.m. So about a 40-minute workout, right? But we know from his call log, he starts calling her at 5:24 when he's still in the gym. Why? Why is he calling her at that point if he's calling and calling because he can't get in? The other question is, if he breached the door, why wasn't there more damage? Some experts say that what was loosened at that metal latch of the door isn't really indicative of what you would see in a door breach. And I've heard this from law enforcement experts that I've had on my show. So if he's the only one there and he's the only witness to this, then it seems like a fact, Holly, that can still be in dispute, whether he had to break the door down to get inside.
So many questions. Okay, so do we know what floor she lived on? And is there a possibility, do they look at the fact that maybe he locked the front door, set that latch, went out a window, down and out, and perhaps did it?
That's a great question. So we do know the floor. The floor is floor 6 of this building, so it would be high up, and investigators thought that would be unlikely because the snow already started to fall. It was a snowy night in January, as you noted, back in the year 2011. And so everybody was kind of hunkering down, so to speak, getting ready to weather the storm. And we know that the fiance had been at home with Ellen Greenberg through much of the afternoon and into the early evening hours. So they think that's unlikely, that somebody would have gone out the balcony. I can tell you that in this brand new autopsy report that did a review of the original report and also all of the consulting autopsy reports, they talk about another member of that apartment community who lived on the same floor as Ellen Greenberg, who is said to have witnessed her fiance being unable to get in the door and said to have come over and offered the advice that you and I were just talking about, Holly, about, hey, why don't you have a key? Can't you use your key or go to the front desk? And apparently the fiance's answer was, well, I can't because look, it's latched. And this witness told authorities that he or she saw that it appeared to be latched from the inside. And there are, of course, some theories for people that think someone else did this to her. There's a theory about using a magnet to move that metal bar. That could something really genius have been done. Or did she do this to herself? As this present medical examiner is opining, Holly, this Emmy is acknowledging that it's weird and it may seem stunning and unusual, but that the placement of the injuries don't make it impossible for Ellen Greenberg to have done this to herself.
And Julie, there's a state law in Pennsylvania that a medical examiner can be wrong to the manner of death, yet cannot be compelled to change it. Do you think this is the case here?
No, I don't think the case ends here. I think it can go a couple places. So I think it can go back to the Attorney General's office, because there, as my understanding, have already been appeals when now Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro was the Attorney General in that office. My understanding was it already went there, as the Greenberg family has been fighting for years and years, as you know, Holly, to try to get justice for what they believe was the homicide of their daughter. And so I think that there can be a new appeal to the Attorney General's office. And I also think that if there's any impropriety here, and I don't know, but there are certainly facts that seem very suspicious to me. Like, for example, why was this fiance's uncle going into that crime scene and confiscating devices? And why was that crime scene not properly processed? Why was it released too soon, so that a professional cleaning company could come in before all the evidence has been gathered? These questions are why I say this case stinks to high heaven. And if there was impropriety at the state level, there can be an appeal to the federal level, to the federal government, to our DOJ, for the FBI to come in and take a good hard look at what investigators did. And at the very least, they didn't properly process the scene or vet everybody.
And we will follow this with you. Our sister station, Court TV's Julie Grant, thank you so much for explaining all this morning. Fascinating case. I know there's so much more. We will watch Court TV, watch you as this case continues. Thanks, Julie.
Thank you, Holly.
Coming up on Today As It Happened.
The Republicans are on the defensive. They keep changing their stories and changing their arguments. But we are on the side of the American people.
We're glad you're back with Today As It Happened. I'm Holly Furfer here with your daily rundown of today's top stories.
Many of you have asked all of us, how will it end? We have no idea. I met with Leader Thune, and he offered to Chuck Schumer a vote on Obamacare subsidies, and Schumer said no. that happened. Asked Leader Thune about it, because they wanted a guaranteed outcome. Here's why we can't do that. Let me say this very clearly and for everyone again. Okay. The Obamacare subsidy issue is not the issue of today. It is in a subsidy that expires December 31. We were always planning to continue the debate and discussion about that issue in October and November. Ironically, Democrats are taking the time off the clock for us to do that.
It is now day 16 of the government shutdown, the 10th attempt to vote and reopen the government just failing as the finger pointing among lawmakers continues. And a new AP NORC poll showing most Americans blame all of the major players for the shutdown. Scripps News congressional correspondent Nathaniel Reed is live on Capitol Hill. And Nate, what is the latest right now?
Well, look, Del, after the 10th failure, the growing sense up here on Capitol Hill is that President Trump will likely need to step in here and end this one himself. He will need to be the person bringing people to the negotiating table, getting some sort of bipartisan agreement on these Affordable Care Act subsidies, which he's expressed some interest in continuing, or at least working out a deal to continue. The president has been focused, very much on international issues, international affairs, ending the war in Ukraine, trying to bring a peaceful end to the war between Hamas and Israel. At this point, the president taking kind of a backseat for these negotiations, which are largely non-existent, Del. These talks really are not happening. On Capitol Hill, there are some member-to-member discussions, but the growing sense up here is that President Trump will need to step in, will need to lead negotiations, possibly push Speaker Johnson to call the House of Representatives back. But one thing is clear, this stalemate not changing. It's Groundhog Day here on Capitol Hill. Take a listen. What's the way out of this shutdown? Is there some sort of bipartisan off-ramp that's emerging, or is it the same as ever?
Well, number one, President Trump has to be involved because the Republicans won't move unless he gives them their blessing. Number two, the off-ramp is that we continue the tax credits so folks can afford their insurance.
Does President Trump need to get involved to end this stalemate?
I think he is involved. I mean, he said that he's willing to make a deal. So I would just say to Democrats and Republicans, send the president a deal he can sign. I mean, let's get this over. It's too long, way too long.
And at this point, there is no deal, and that as there was some reporting this morning that there was possibly some sort of agreement or an offer from the Senate Majority Leader John Thune to Democrats to allow them to try and take a vote on extending the Affordable Care Act subsidies. Ultimately, Democrats saying that whatever was presented to them either did not exist, was not a realistic deal, or something that they would not be willing to accept at this point. Again, the growing sense here that whatever deal is reached will need to involve congressional leadership and President Donald Trump. Here's the Senate Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer.
And Leader Thune has not come to me with any proposal at this point. We are fighting for the American people. The Republicans can talk all the political stuff they want. We're on the side of the American people because they need help.
From the very beginning of this crisis, Senate Democrats and House Democrats have made clear we are fighting to address the health care crisis that Republicans have created, the largest cut to Medicaid in American history.
You just heard the Democratic leaders there making clear that they don't think that there is a deal right now. They still want assurances from the president, from the commander-in-chief. They want an indication that something that they've reached an agreement on would actually be actionable. And for that reason, in fact, we find ourselves here. Senators very slowly leaving Washington for the weekend. You can see Senator Ted Cruz up there on the steps walking down. A lot of members headed to their cars and headed home for the weekend. Again, another weekend where the government will be shut down, where there is no deal to reopen the government. And at this point, we still do not know how long this thing could go. It could last several more weeks. Again, we do not know when President Trump will take a front seat here or lead negotiations, or if that's even a role that he's willing to play. But at this point, there's no end in sight. Both parties dug in as ever. That, as the American people, according to that AP NORC poll, are blaming both parties for this ongoing government shutdown. Day 16, Del, the 10th vote just failed. No end of this in sight.
Nate, you always answer my next question before I even get to ask it. I was going to ask you if you were starting to see some movement, but it appears what you're showing is the movement to the airport and not necessarily the movement towards getting anything done in Washington.
We've already had members tell us this afternoon that they have to catch a flight and don't have time to answer questions. Again, this is peak flyout day, members going back to their home districts. Republicans had hoped that Democrats were getting pressure from their constituents to start to vote in favor of a government funding deal. Democrats saying they believe their base, they believe the Democratic Party is behind them in this fight.
Scripps News congressional correspondent Nathaniel Reed for us live on Capitol Hill. Nate, as always, thanks for keeping us up to date.
Thanks, Del.
A federal judge in Chicago has ordered ICE agents to wear and turn on their body cams. Judge Sarah Ellis saying she saw officers using tear gas and other aggressive steps towards protesters. Last week, she ordered the agents to wear badges and banned them from using certain riot control techniques when the protests are peaceful, saying, quote, "I'm having concerns about my order being followed." The Justice Department blames what they called one-sided and selectively edited media reports, adding, "Not all ICE agents have body cams." The judge saying she understood and will work out the details later. There has been another legal setback for the Trump administration. This time it involves efforts to withhold nearly $34 million earmarked for anti-terror funds for the New York City transit system. A federal judge ruling the administration can't do it. Judge Lewis Kaplan saying the White House decision was based on the city's refusal to participate in its immigration crackdown. He called that move arbitrary, capricious, and a blatant violation of the law. Kaplan saying the post-9/11 transit security grant program was allocated solely on the basis of the risk of terrorism. So he says those funds must be permanently restored.
We'll be right back to continue our look at today's top stories. Welcome back to Today As It Happened. I'm Holly Furfer. All right, let's jump right back into our rundown of the top stories of the day.
President Trump saying he will meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Hungary. The goal is to try and resolve the Russia-Ukraine war, but he did not say when that meeting will take place. Meanwhile, the president plans to host Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky for talks tomorrow to talk about potential weapons sales, specifically those Tomahawk cruise missiles. Scripps News international correspondent Jason Bellini is live in Washington, D.C. with what the White House had to say about that call today. And Jason, exactly sum it up for us.
Del, first thing I want to tell you is that I just spoke with a source who told me that that meeting that Putin and Trump discussed, not likely to happen in the next few weeks, but next week, according to Carolyn Levitt, the White House spokesperson, high-level delegations from the U.S. and from Russia, they'll be meeting. Not clear where that's going to take place. but Secretary of State Marco Rubio will be leading the U.S. delegation for peace talks. So they're back underway. The other thing we learned from Carol Levin is that this call lasted for more than 2 hours. And I can tell you that the Ukrainians, they're not happy about this because they're concerned that Trump is hearing the perspective of Putin and is going to make more concessions to him just when Trump seemed to be on Ukraine's, forcefully, vocally on Ukraine's side in this war. Now, the other thing that we've been watching is how Ukraine is implementing a strategy, and that is to attack Russia's energy infrastructure, their ability to produce oil. And they're having some dramatic effects. I've been collecting video on this for the last month or so. I want to show you now what kind of impact this is having.
The images have flooded social media week after week. Ukrainian strikes far inside Russia, halting Russian oil flows. Though each individual strike can't be verified, they visualize a confirmed reality. Long-range Ukrainian drones and missiles hitting Russian oil refineries, around 40% of them, pumping stations, tank cars, pipelines. This video purports to show one of the largest refineries that produced fuel for Putin's army, located more than 900 miles from Ukraine's border. Footage from inside Russia shows cars waiting hours to buy gas, prices about 40% higher than last year. Ukraine's strategy is simple: make ordinary Russians feel the pain directly, pummel Putin's largest source of war revenue, and perhaps tank his country's economy. The Financial Times reporting this week that Trump is not just on board with the strategy, the U.S. is helping by sharing intelligence with Kyiv on where and when to strike.
And Bloomberg today is reporting that Russia's fuel exports are the lowest since 2022, before the full-scale invasion. Dell?
Jason, overnight, Russia launching another large-scale missile attack. They now targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure. What can you tell us about that?
So we're talking about 37 missiles, ballistic missiles, and also cruise missiles that were launched all over Ukraine. And as a result, in several regions, there are rolling blackouts as they assess the damage, trying to figure out what's required to fix the infrastructure that was hit overnight. There were also more than 300 drones that Russia used. Injuries across the country have been reported, 7 people killed in one region, including one child. You know, this is the kind of thing that President Trump has been criticizing heavily. He's been saying that that since the Alaska summit, that Putin has not let up, has not stopped hitting civilian infrastructure. So it'll be very interesting what comes out of this meeting tomorrow. What is Trump's tone towards Zelensky after they have a chance to meet? Again, this comes after Trump managed to get an earful from President Putin. And we don't know the particulars of what they said other than that they plan to meet. And one other note on that, Carolyn Levitt said that there's the possibility of President Zelensky and Putin meeting, that the door has not been closed on that. After the Alaska summit, you may remember, you had Trump calling for that, but Putin was saying, well, he can come to Moscow and meet with me. And that obviously a non-starter for Zelensky. Del?
Yeah, that meeting was to take place in roughly 3 weeks. Our international correspondent, Jason Bellini. Jason, as always, we thank you very much. Today, the president calling Russian President Vladimir Putin, talking for at least 2 hours as both leaders now look to set up another high-profile meeting. Scripps News White House correspondent Haley Bull is live on the North Lawn. And Haley, what do we know about the president's conversation with the Russian leader?
Yeah, Del, certainly a significant conversation, one that President Trump is calling very productive, and that the White House says the president believes they made good progress in. It was a more than 2-hour phone call today ahead of President Trump's meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky tomorrow. as President Trump has suggested in recent days, considerations of additional capabilities for Ukraine. Now, out of that call between Trump and Putin, which Russian state media says was initiated by the Russians, the White House says President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin have agreed for a senior staff level meeting next week on the U.S. side, led by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, to be followed by a second meeting between Trump and Putin, potentially in Budapest, Hungary. Now, this comes after Trump and Putin met in Alaska in August. Since then, Russia has intensified its strikes against Ukraine and not indicated a willingness to meet directly with President Zelensky. Now, the White House says that President Trump, still thinks it is possible that he can get both leaders in the room. This call comes at a significant time, as President Trump has recently continued to share his disappointment with Russian President Vladimir Putin, but has yet to move forward on actions he has threatened over the course of the past couple months, including tougher economic penalties against Russia. The president in recent days had suggested he may discuss sending Tomahawks to Ukraine with Putin, telling Putin, he had said, if the war isn't settled, they may do it. Notably, President Trump's readout of his call with President Putin did not give any indication of that conversation. However, Russian state media says Putin informed Trump that those missiles won't change the battlefield situation in their view, but would, quote, damage Russia-U.S. relations and the settlement process in Ukraine. Notably, Russia has not publicly offered any significant change in its position towards Ukraine or what it believes would be needed to end the war. Now, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky arriving in Washington today, saying that he is meeting with American energy companies as well as defense companies to discuss air defense systems, as he has called for more of those and longer range capabilities. And experts we have talked with really signal that if the U.S. were to allow that, it would be an important, essentially, in Washington this week, meeting with Secretary of State Marco Rubio and a number of lawmakers across the aisle, discussing these top priorities for Ukraine. Certainly a high-stakes meeting as they and Europeans look for continued U.S. support in this effort. Del?
Scripps News White House correspondent Haley Bullforce. Haley, as always, we thank you very much.
We'll be right back with more of today's top stories on Today As It Happened. This is Today As It Happened, Scripps News debrief of our top stories of the day. So let's jump right back in.
It is breaking news. Ex-Trump National Security Advisor John Bolton has been indicted. Scripps News Washington correspondent Stephanie Liebergen has been tracking the developments in our newsroom. And Stephanie, we know the story is only minutes old, but what are we finding out so far?
Well, we do now have the indictment document. It is a 26-page indictment that spells out 18 counts that Bolton was indicted on. Now, about half of those counts, the first 8 of them, are transmission of national defense information. The second set of counts, there are 10 counts of retention of national defense information. So on those transmission counts, this document is alleging that on 8 separate occasions that Bolton sent classified information in unapproved or over a personal email, sent it between the time of September 2018 through September 2019. So that is while he was serving in President Trump's first administration as one of his national security advisors. The second set of counts, the retention of national defense information, those 10 counts are linked from Bolton allegedly having the classified documents at his home in Maryland in the time frame of that going from April 2018 all the way up until August 2025. And that's when that FBI search of Bolton's home took place at his home in Maryland, Del, that we were just talking about a few minutes ago. So the allegations in this indictment say that Bolton used a personal email or messaging apps to send classified information, and that some of that information was as high as top secret level, and that the intel, the court document, the indictment saying the intel included information about future attacks, about foreign adversaries, and foreign policy relations. Again, this is a 26-page indictment spelling out 18 different counts that John Bolton was indicted on today out of Maryland. I am still digging through this court document, kind of looking for all of the individual pieces of information, but it does really seem that this is stemming all the way back to his time as a national security advisor working in the president's first administration. Things we do know about this investigation, it's something that has been going on for quite some time. This investigation and this indictment of John Bolton is arguably different than the recent indictments we've seen that came out of the Eastern District of Virginia, indicting the former FBI Director James Comey and indicting the Attorney General of New York, Letitia James. Those two indictments are seen as far more controversial, far more questionable by some experts in the Department of Justice and some former Department of Justice employees, saying that those could be viewed as political retribution, that those are viewed as retaliation potentially by the president and by the president's Department of Justice. This investigation of Bolton is much lengthier. It had been going on for a much longer period of time. The current head of the Department of Justice in the state of Maryland is a longtime DOJ employee. She's been serving in this office since 2013. So there does need to be, I think, as we're talking about these indictments of people who are, on President Trump's bad side, if you will, there's a distinction, I think, to be made between this indictment of John Bolton and the other indictments of Comey and of Letitia James. But again, I'm just now getting a chance to kind of dig through this document. I'm going to keep looking through it, and I'm sure I will be back with you, Del, once I've got a little bit more sussed out from the docs.
Stephanie, before I let you go, though, it is safe to point out that there is no love lost between John Bolton and President Trump. He has been extremely critical of President Trump, but even the best legal minds say that this one is different because two federal judges had to sign off on those search warrants. And this, as you indicated, is a very deep and well-researched indictment as opposed to the indictment against James Comey, which I believe was just 2 pages. So this is one that, as they say in the legal community, might have legs.
That's absolutely right. I think, noting that this indictment is 26 pages, and you are right, the Comey indictment was just 2 pages. And even when James Comey was showing up for his arraignment in federal court, his attorneys were still saying they don't have the details. They were still waiting for information from the government. The Letitia James indictment had a little bit more information on the charges against her for the mortgage fraud charges related to a home that she bought in the Norfolk, Virginia area. But again, this indictment definitely more detailed. As you noted, it's gone through multiple stages. There was that search warrant that the FBI needed to get that search warrant request to a federal judge then, I think, was also a couple dozen pages long. The number's escaping me at this very moment. But yes, there certainly seems to be, at first glance, again, we are just getting this information and just getting these documents now, certainly seems to be a distinction between this indictment of John Bolton and the other indictments that are certainly seen by some in the legal world as much more questionable and much more controversial, though.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening for Today As It Happened. I'm Holly Furfer. We hope you have a great Thursday night.